The gold band was a small, perfect circle of sunlight trapped under the thick, greasy glass of the general store counter, a lonely star in a universe of dust motes and grime. It made no sound as she laid it down, the metal absorbing the quiet of the room, but its presence was a shout in the afternoon stillness, a final desperate statement offered up for judgment. The hand that had placed it there trembled, not from weakness, but from the sheer force of will it took to keep it from snatching the ring back, and the knuckles were scraped raw, the skin around the nails cracked and stained with the kind of dirt that doesn't come from a single day's travel, but from a lifetime of hard labor. She was a ghost of a woman, all sharp angles and hollows beneath a worn dress the color of the road, and her eyes, fixed on the shopkeeper's face, held the flat, depthless look of someone who had stared at the horizon for too long, waiting for something that never came. He was a man made of soft, round shapes, his belly straining the buttons of his vest, and his face a pale moon of indecision, and he looked from the ring to her face and back again, his gaze lingering on the raw, chapped line of her lips. He did not ask her name. He did not ask her story. He saw only the transaction, the small gleam of value against the backdrop of her obvious poverty, and his mind worked its slow, methodical arithmetic of profit and loss. He picked up the ring with two thick fingers, as if handling something distasteful, and held it to the light, his eyes squinting to find the flaw, the scratch, the hidden imperfection that would allow him to drive the price down because that was his nature. It was the nature of the town. "It's not worth much," he said, his voice a low, greasy murmur, not looking at her but at the gold in his hand. She did not flinch, did not argue, her stillness a rebuke to his casual cruelty. Her silence was an answer in itself, a brittle wall against which his words fell flat. He knew it was worth more. He knew what it was. But he also knew she had no other choice. She needed what he had, and he had what she needed. And in that simple, brutal equation, all other considerations fell away. He named a price that was an insult, a fraction of its true value, and watched her face for the break, for the tear, for the collapse that would affirm his power. She just nodded, a single sharp dip of her chin. The bargain was struck. The money he counted out was a pittance, a handful of coins and worn bills that felt weightless in her palm, a poor substitute for the years and the vows the ring represented. She accepted it without a word, her fingers closing around the meager sum, and then her gaze moved past him, to the wall behind the counter where the tools of survival hung in neat, orderly rows. Her eyes settled on a rifle, a Winchester, its woodstock dark and oiled, its barrel a long line of flat, blue-black steel. It was not new, but it was cared for. Beside it, on a lower peg, hung a coiled lariat and a bridle, the leather cracked but sound. "That," she said, her voice raspy from disuse, the first word she had spoken, "and the bridle." The shopkeeper's eyebrows rose, a flicker of surprise disturbing the placid surface of his greed. He had expected her to buy flour, bacon, a ticket on the eastbound stage, not a weapon, not the means to travel alone. The calculation in his eyes shifted, suspicion clouding his features. A woman like her, alone, buying a rifle. It was not right. It was not normal. It was a disruption to the quiet, predictable misery he understood. He began to protest, to hedge, to explain that such an item required, but she cut him off, not with a word, but by pushing the entire sum of money back across the counter, all of it. Her gaze did not waver. It was not a request. It was a demand. He hesitated, a long, drawn-out moment where the fate of the small gold ring and the long, dark rifle hung in the balance, and in that silence, another man entered the store. He was tall and weathered, his face a landscape of sun and wind, and his movements were slow and deliberate, as if he were conserving energy for a task that might never come. He did not look at the woman or the shopkeeper, his attention fixed on a sack of grain near the door, but he heard everything. He felt the tension in the room, a palpable thing, thick as molasses. The shopkeeper saw him, saw the quiet authority in his stillness, and his resolve wavered. This was Elias Thorne, a man who kept to himself, whose ranch bordered the unforgiving Badlands, but a man whose opinion, rarely given, carried the weight of stone. The shopkeeper's greed won out over his suspicion. He took the money, he took the rifle down from the wall. He handed it to her, along with the bridle, and she took them with a reverence that was almost painful to watch, her hands tracing the cold steel and the worn leather as if they were holy relics. She had traded her past for a future she would have to defend. She turned and walked out of the store, the rifle held across her body, a shield against the world. She did not look back. Elias Thorne watched her go, his expression unreadable, and then his gaze fell to the counter, to the small empty space on the greasy glass where the gold ring had been. He lingered for a moment, his thoughts his own, then he hefted the sack of grain onto his shoulder and followed her out into the blinding, indifferent sun. Afternoon. The sun was a hammer, beating down on the dusty strip of land that called itself a town, bleaching the color from the clapboard storefronts and raising shimmering waves of heat from the dirt. The few people who were out moved slowly, their faces grim, their eyes narrowed against the glare. They saw the woman with the rifle, and they looked away. They saw her, but they did not see her. They saw a problem, a question they did not want to answer, and so they made her invisible, erasing her with their indifference. She walked toward the livery at the far end of the street, her steps even and measured, the weight of the rifle a strange and unfamiliar comfort in her arms. She needed a horse, a good one that could carry her far and fast, one that would not fail her when the miles stretched out and the water ran low. The liveryman was a sour, stooped figure who spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust near her feet as she approached, a gesture of casual contempt that she absorbed without reaction. He looked her up and down, his gaze lingering on the rifle, and a slow, unpleasant smile stretched his lips. "What you want?" he rasped, his voice like stones grinding together. "A horse," she said. "The best one you've got." He laughed, a dry, rattling sound. "The best one I got ain't for the likes of you, not for what you can pay." His eyes flickered to the thinness of her dress, the gauntness of her face. He had seen her come out of the general store. He knew she was newly poor, freshly desperate. He gestured with his thumb toward a pen at the back of the lot, where a collection of sad, broken-down creatures stood listlessly in the heat, their heads hanging, their ribs stark against their hides. "There's your choices. Take one or leave it." She looked at the animals, at their dull eyes and unsteady legs, and a cold knot of despair tightened in her stomach. They would not last a day. They were death on 4 legs. She had traded everything for this, for a chance, and the chance was being denied her at the final hurdle. She stood there, frozen, the rifle feeling suddenly heavy and useless, the bridle in her hand a mockery. The world was a closed door, and she had just spent her only key on the wrong lock. It was then that Elias Thorne's shadow fell over her. He had come from the feed store, his own business concluded, but he had not gone to his wagon. He had walked this way instead, drawn by a current he did not name but could not ignore. He stopped a few feet away, not looking at her, but at the liveryman. "She needs a good horse, Jeb," he said, his voice calm and even, carrying easily in the still, hot air. It was not a command, but it was not a suggestion either. It was a statement of fact. Jeb the liveryman turned, his sneer faltering slightly when he saw who it was. He had a long and unprofitable history of trying to sell Elias Thorne bad stock, and he had learned that the rancher's quiet eyes saw everything. "Thorne," he grumbled, "this ain't your business." "She's buying a horse," Elias replied, his gaze still on the liveryman. "Selling horses is your business. Seems to me it's everyone's business." He shifted his weight, a small, almost imperceptible movement, but it drew the eye. He was not a large man, but he was solid, rooted to the earth, a part of the harsh landscape rather than a temporary visitor. Jeb's face soured further. He could not so easily dismiss Elias Thorne, a man who bought feed by the wagon load and whose word was trusted at the bank. He spat again, this time with more frustration than contempt. "She ain't got the money for a good horse." "Did you ask her?" Elias said, his voice still quiet. He turned his head for the first time and looked at the woman. Lena. Her name was Lena, though no one in this town knew it. He didn't know it either, but he saw the person, not the category. He saw the scraped knuckles and the straightness of her spine. He saw the exhaustion and the iron will that held it at bay. "I have this," she said, her voice low, and she held up the bridle. It was all she had left. A silence fell. The liveryman snorted in derision. A bridle for a horse. It was a fool's bargain. But Elias Thorne's eyes were on the bridle, on the way she held it, on the simple, profound fact that she was offering her last possession, not for food, not for shelter, but for the means of escape. He saw the story in that gesture, a story of desperation so deep it had burned away everything but the need to keep moving. He turned back to the liveryman. "I'll be selling you a string of geldings come fall, Jeb," he said, his tone conversational. "Good ones. You'll want to be on my good side when I set the price." The threat was unspoken but perfectly clear. Jeb's jaw tightened. He looked from Elias's unyielding face to Lena's stark and silent one. He was trapped between his greed and his future profit. "Fine," he snarled, throwing his hands up in disgust. "But she ain't getting my best. Not for a damned bridle." Elias nodded slowly. "She won't need your best," he said, his gaze shifting to a dusty corner of the corral where a powerful-looking buckskin stood apart from the others, its coat the color of sun-cured leather. It was his horse. He had ridden it into town. "She'll be taking mine." The liveryman stared, dumbfounded. Lena stared, her composure finally cracking, a flicker of disbelief in her wide, haunted eyes. Elias walked past her, his boots scuffing in the thick dust, and moved toward the buckskin. He did not offer an explanation. He did not wait for an answer. He untied the reins from the hitching post, his movements economical and sure. He led the horse back to where she stood, the animal following him with the quiet trust of a well-treated creature. He stopped in front of her and held out the reins. "He's sound," Elias said. "He'll get you where you're going." She looked at the reins, then at his face, searching for the trick, the angle, the hidden cost. There was none. His eyes were clear, his expression placid. He was simply giving her a horse worth 10 of the one she could have afforded, a horse worth 100 of the rings she had sold. She reached out a hesitant hand and took the leather straps. They felt solid and real. A promise. "I have nothing to pay you," she whispered, the words catching in her throat. Elias looked at the bridle still clutched in her other hand. "You have a bridle," he said. He took it from her, his calloused fingers brushing against hers for a fleeting second, and with a nod, he turned and walked away, leaving her standing in the swirling dust with a rifle, a good horse, and the bewildering, unexpected weight of a stranger's kindness. He did not look back. That night she did not ride out. The gift of the horse had changed the equation, giving her a moment to breathe, a sliver of time to think beyond the next desperate step. She took a room at the boarding house, a small, airless space under the eaves that smelled of stale linen and regret. But it was a fortress. She paid for it with the last few coins the shopkeeper had given her for the ring, the money that was supposed to have bought the rifle, now freed up by Elias Thorne's impossible act. She leaned the Winchester against the wall by the bed, where her hand could find it in the dark, and she sat on the lumpy mattress, listening to the sounds of the town dying down. Shouts from the saloon faded into murmurs, the slam of a door echoed down the empty street, and then there was only the wind, a low, mournful sigh that rattled the window pane. She did not sleep. She thought of the man who had given her a horse. She had seen him before, a distant figure moving through the heat haze on the edge of town, but she had never spoken to him, never met his gaze until this afternoon. There was a stillness about him, a deep, settled quiet that was the opposite of the frantic, hunted feeling that had been her constant companion for months. He had looked at her and seen something other than a threat or a victim. He had seen a person in need of a tool, and he had provided it. It was a simple, practical act, as unadorned as the man himself, and yet it felt like a miracle. She wondered what he wanted. No one gave away a horse like that for nothing. There was always a price, a debt to be collected. She had learned that lesson over and over, written in bruises and betrayals. Perhaps he would come for her. Perhaps this was just a different kind of trap, a more patient one. The thought sent a chill through her, but it was a familiar fear, one she knew how to manage. She would be ready. She would be gone before sunrise. But as the hours crept by and the moon climbed high, a different thought began to take root. He had not asked for her name. He had not asked where she was going. He had looked at the bridle, taken it as payment, and walked away. The transaction was clean. It was finished. Maybe, just maybe, it was exactly what it appeared to be, an act of grace in a graceless world. The idea was so foreign, so dangerous in its hopefulness, that she almost dismissed it. Hope was a luxury she could not afford. Hope made you slow, made you soft. But the memory of his calm, steady eyes stayed with her. He had not looked at her with pity or with desire or with the calculating assessment she was so used to. He had looked at her with a kind of quiet understanding. He had seen the tool she needed and understood its purpose. Down the street, in the dim light of his own small rented room above the feed store, Elias Thorne sat by a window, also awake. He had bought back her ring. He had gone back to the general store as the sun was setting, the shopkeeper locking up for the night, and he had placed a stack of coins on the counter that was significantly larger than the one the woman had received. The shopkeeper, a man named Miller, had protested, claiming the ring was already spoken for, that it was a special order. Elias had simply waited, his silence more powerful than any argument, until Miller's blustering had subsided into a grudging acceptance. The ring now sat on the small table beside him, a tiny gleam in the moonlight. He did not know why he had bought it. It was an impulse, an illogical act for a man who lived his life by the steady, predictable logic of seasons and livestock. He had seen the woman's face when she sold it, the flicker of agony she had so quickly suppressed, and he had understood that she was not just selling a piece of metal, she was cutting off a part of herself, cauterizing a wound. He had bought the horse for a practical reason. She needed to get away, and the broken-down nags at the livery were a death sentence. A person deserved a fair chance, even a stranger. But the ring was different. The ring was not practical. It was a story. And he had felt a sudden, fierce need to keep that story from being melted down or sold to a stranger for a cheap profit. He held it in his palm, the metal cool against his skin. It was worn smooth, the inside bearing faint, unreadable scratches where an inscription might once have been. He thought of his own wife's ring, buried with her these 10 long years, a weight he still felt on his heart like a phantom limb. He understood the gravity of such an object. He would hold on to it for her. Perhaps one day he would see her again, and he could return it. Perhaps not. It didn't matter. The act itself was what mattered. It was a small piece of order restored in a chaotic world, a debt paid to a ghost. He placed the ring carefully in his worn leather pouch, alongside a spare firing pin and a few dried jerky strips. And finally, as the first hint of gray lightened the eastern sky, he lay down to sleep. Days later. The dust of the road had settled, but the memory of it remained, a fine grit in the back of her throat, a constant reminder of how close she had come to disappearing into the vast, indifferent landscape. Lena had not fled. Against every instinct honed by months of running, she had stayed. She had ridden the buckskin out of town at dawn, not east toward the faceless sanctuary of the territories, but north, toward the high plains and the broken country where Elias Thorne's ranch was said to be. It was a fool's choice, a dangerous gamble, but the logic was undeniable. The man who had given her a horse was the only person in 100 miles who had not looked at her like she was a piece of trash. If there was a place to stop running, even for a moment, it might be near him. She found the turnoff by a gnarled, lightning-scarred cottonwood he had described to the liveryman, a landmark visible for miles. The trail was little more than 2 ruts in the earth, winding up into a series of low, rolling hills covered in sparse grass and juniper. The land was hard, but it was honest. It promised nothing but what you could take from it with your own 2 hands. His ranch was not a grand affair. It was a small, defensible cluster of buildings nestled in a shallow valley. A sturdy-looking cabin of peeled logs, a barn, and a web of corrals. Everything was in good repair, the fences taut, the gate swinging smoothly on its hinges. It was the home of a man who paid attention to details. She saw him before he saw her. He was mending a fence line on the far side of the valley, working with a steady, unhurried rhythm, his movements as predictable and reassuring as the rising of the sun. She stopped the horse on a low rise, the rifle resting across her lap, and watched him for a long time. She was trespassing. She knew it. In this part of the country, that was an offense that could be answered with a bullet, no questions asked. But she did not feel like a trespasser. She felt like a scout, surveying the terrain before a crucial battle. Finally, he straightened up, wiping his brow with the back of his forearm, and his gaze swept the horizon, a habitual check of his domain. He saw her. He did not startle. He did not reach for the rifle that was leaning against a fence post nearby. He simply stood there, a dark, solid shape against the pale sky, and watched her. The distance was too great for words. It was a standoff of stillness. She could turn the horse and ride away, and he would likely let her go. The debt was paid, the transaction complete, or she could ride forward. She nudged the buckskin with her heels. The horse moved down the slope, its hooves making soft thuds in the dry soil. As she drew closer, she could see the details of his face, the deep lines etched around his eyes, the set of his jaw. There was no welcome in his expression, but there was no hostility either. There was only a quiet, waiting curiosity. She stopped the horse a few feet from him. The air was thick with the scent of sage and dry earth. "The horse is sound," she said, her voice rough. It was the only thing she could think of to say, a statement of fact, an acknowledgement of the quality of his gift. He nodded, his eyes on the animal. "He is." A long silence stretched between them, filled only by the buzzing of a fly and the sigh of the wind through the grass. She had come all this way with no plan, no words prepared, driven by an impulse she still did not fully understand. "I can work," she said abruptly, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "I can mend fence. I can break horses. I can cook. I can shoot." She stopped, her breath catching. She was offering herself up, listing her meager skills like a peddler displaying his wares. It felt demeaning, desperate. He looked at her hands, still resting on the stock of the rifle. He had noticed them in town, the scraped knuckles, the calluses. They were not the hands of a lady, nor of a saloon girl. They were the hands of someone who knew what a day's labor felt like. His gaze lifted to her face. He saw the fierce, desperate pride in her eyes, the terror she was trying so hard to conceal. He had lived alone for 10 years, his world small and contained, his grief a quiet, constant companion. He had not sought this complication. He had not wanted it, but here it was. A woman with haunted eyes and capable hands, sitting on his horse on his land. To send her away would be to send her back into the jaws of whatever she was running from. It would be a cruelty, and he was not a cruel man. He was merely a solitary one. "The bunkhouse roof needs patching," he said, his voice flat and non-committal. "And I've got a string of colts that need gentling." He turned his back to her then, picking up his tools, his posture indicating that the conversation was over. "You can start in the morning." It was not a welcome. It was not an offer of friendship. It was a job. For Lena, who had expected nothing, it was everything. She watched him walk back toward the cabin, his stride long and even, and for the first time in a very long time, she felt the tight, cold knot of fear in her chest begin to loosen, just a fraction. She had a place to be. She had work to do. She had a morning to look forward to. It was enough. Weeks later, the rhythm of the ranch took hold of her, a steady, grounding beat that pushed the frantic pulse of the road further and further into memory. She rose before the sun, the air cool and sharp in her lungs, and she worked until the last light had faded from the sky, her body aching with a clean, honest fatigue that was a world away from the soul-deep exhaustion of fear. She was a good worker. Elias Thorne saw it on the first day. She moved with a quiet competence, her hands sure, her mind quick. She patched the bunkhouse roof with shingles he had cut years ago and left stacked in the barn, her hammer strokes even and efficient. She began working with the colts, her voice a low, soothing murmur, her movements slow and deliberate, earning their trust with a patience that seemed bottomless. She never complained. She never asked for anything. They lived and worked in a shared, almost monastic silence. Their days were a series of parallel actions, their paths crossing in the barn or the corral, but rarely intersecting. They ate their meals at the same rough-hewn table in his cabin, but often without a word passing between them. The silence was not awkward or hostile. It was a space they both seemed to need, a buffer against a world that was too loud and too demanding. He would watch her sometimes when she was not aware of it, as she stood with a horse, her hand resting on its neck, her face softened in a way he never saw otherwise. He saw the resilience in her, the tough, fibrous core of a person who had been bent but had refused to break. He still did not know her story, where she had come from, or what she was running from, and he did not ask. He had offered her a place to work, not a confessional. He respected her privacy as fiercely as he guarded his own. In turn, she learned the contours of his solitude. She saw the way he would pause in his work and stare at the western hills, his face filled with a sorrow so profound it seemed to suck the air out of the space around him. She saw the worn photograph of a woman and a small child on the mantelpiece, their faces faded, their smiles ghosts. She understood that his quiet was not emptiness, but a space filled with loss. One evening, a dust-caked rider appeared on the horizon, a man from a neighboring ranch miles away, bringing news and gossip. He ate with them, his loud voice filling the small cabin, a jarring intrusion into their quiet world. He spoke of disputes over water rights, of a cattle rustling operation down south, and then, his eyes landing on Lena, he mentioned a man who had passed through his territory a week prior. A fellow named Croft, the neighbor said, spearing a piece of potato. Silas Croft, a land speculator, he says, asking questions, looking for a woman. Matched your description, he said, pointing his fork at Lena. Said she stole a horse from him, a fine buckskin. Lena went perfectly still. The fork in her hand paused halfway to her mouth. The color drained from her face, leaving it a stark white mask. Elias did not look at her. His gaze remained fixed on the neighbor, his expression unchanging, but a new tension entered his body, a coiling stillness that was more menacing than any sudden movement. "Is that so?" Elias said, his voice dangerously soft. The neighbor, oblivious to the sudden shift in the atmosphere, nodded enthusiastically. "That's what he said. Put up a reward for the horse. $100. More for the woman," he said with a wink. Said she was his wife. The word hung in the air. Wife. Elias felt a cold anger rise in him, a protective fury he had not felt in a decade. He thought of the gold ring in his pouch. He thought of her scraped knuckles and her haunted eyes. He had seen desperation and fear, but he had not seen the deceit of a thief. "This Croft," Elias said, his voice even. "What did he look like?" "Smooth talker," the neighbor said around a mouthful of food. "Dressed well, had a pair of hired men with him, looked like trouble." He finally seemed to notice the silence, the way both Elias and Lena were staring into the middle distance. "Well, I suppose it's none of my business. Just thought you should know." He finished his meal quickly after that, the easy flow of his gossip stemmed, and he rode off into the twilight, leaving a thick, ringing silence in his wake. Lena still had not moved. She sat at the table like a statue, her food forgotten. The past she had been outrunning had finally caught up. It had a name, Silas Croft, and he was coming for her. Elias rose from the table and began to clear the dishes, his movements methodical, deliberate. He did not speak. He did not ask if it was true. He did not need to. He had seen the truth in the stark terror on her face. After a long moment, she finally spoke, her voice a raw whisper. "He's not my husband." "I know," Elias said, his back to her. He stopped at the dry sink, his hands submerged in the wash basin. He would spend a long time afterward wondering how he knew what it was in her bearing, in the quiet dignity she carried, that made the accusation of theft so unbelievable. He just did. He had trusted his gut in that dusty livery yard, and he trusted it now. "He will come here," she said, her voice flat with a dreadful certainty. "Yes," Elias agreed. "He will." He turned from the sink, wiping his hands on a cloth. His eyes met hers across the small, shadowed room. For the first time, the space between them was not filled with silence, but with a shared, unspoken understanding. A threat was coming to his home. A threat was coming for this woman he had taken under his protection. The quiet world he had so carefully constructed was about to be broken. He walked to the mantelpiece, took down his own rifle, a heavy Sharps buffalo gun, and began to methodically clean it. The rhythmic scrape and click of the cleaning rod was the only sound in the room. It was the sound of a man preparing for a war he had not chosen but would not run from. Not here, not today, not with her. The waiting was the hardest part. The days that followed were draped in a heavy blanket of suspense, every distant dust cloud a potential threat, every gust of wind sounding like the hoofbeats of approaching riders. They spoke little of it, but the knowledge of Croft's approach was a constant, silent third presence on the ranch. It changed the way they moved, the way they looked at the horizon. Lena worked with a feverish intensity, as if she could build a wall of labor high enough to keep him out. She finished with the colts and moved on to repairing harnesses, her hands deft and sure, her focus absolute. It was her way of fighting the fear, of imposing order on a world that was about to descend into chaos. Elias matched her intensity with his own quiet preparations. He checked every rifle, counted every cartridge. He walked the perimeter of his land, his eyes noting every dip and rise in the terrain, every rock outcropping that could provide cover, every blind spot. He was a man reawakening a part of himself he had thought long buried, the part that knew the grim calculus of a fight. He found her one afternoon by the corral, staring out at the empty plains, her shoulders slumped. The iron control she had maintained for days was finally beginning to fray. He walked up and stood beside her, not speaking, just sharing the view. "You could ride out," he said finally, his voice low. "Take the buckskin and head for the mountains. He won't find you there." It was an offer, a way out. She could save herself and spare him the trouble that was coming to his door. She turned to look at him, her eyes searching his face. "Why aren't you telling me to go?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "It's not your fight." He considered the question for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the distant hazy line where the sky met the earth. "He called you a thief," he said simply. "He's coming to my land to enforce a lie. That makes it my fight." He had spent 10 years avoiding fights, building a life of deliberate peace on the foundation of his grief. But this was different. This was not a squabble over cattle or water. This was an invasion. It was an offense against the quiet truth of his world. A man's land was his own, and the people on it were under his protection. It was a simple, unwritten law, but it was the only one that mattered out here. "My name is Lena," she said, the words soft but clear. It was the first time she had offered it. An offering of trust, a piece of herself given in return for his loyalty. "Elias," he replied with a small, almost imperceptible nod. The introduction, weeks late, felt like a formal declaration, a pact sealed between two solitary people against a common enemy. That evening, as the sun bled across the western sky, they saw them. 3 riders, dark silhouettes against the fiery orange, moving at a steady, unhurried pace. They were not trying to be stealthy. They were coming with the arrogance of men who believed they held all the power. They were coming as if to collect a piece of property that was rightfully theirs. Lena's breath hitched. Her hand went instinctively to the pistol she now wore holstered at her hip, a small Colt that Elias had given her. Elias put a steadying hand on her arm. "Not yet," he said, his voice calm. "We let them come. We do this on our ground." He did not move from the porch of the cabin, but stood there, a solid, unmovable object, watching them approach. Lena stood beside him, her fear a cold, hard knot in her stomach, but it was overlaid with something new, a fragile, tentative sense of belonging. She was not facing this alone. For the first time, she was not running. She was standing her ground. The riders drew closer, their features becoming clear in the fading light. The man in the lead was just as the neighbor had described him, handsome, well-dressed, with a smile that did not reach his cold, assessing eyes. Silas Croft. The 2 men flanking him were rougher, their faces hard, their hands resting near the butts of their pistols. They reined in their horses 20 yards from the cabin, the creak of leather loud in the evening stillness. Croft's smile widened as his eyes fell on Lena. It was a smile of ownership, of triumph. "Well, well," he said, his voice smooth and pleasant, a chilling contrast to the menace radiating from him. "There you are, my dear. I was so worried. And you found a new friend." He looked at Elias, his gaze dismissive, sizing him up as a simple dirt scratcher, an obstacle to be brushed aside. "I've come for my wife," Croft announced to the porch, "and my horse." Elias did not answer. He simply watched, his face a mask of calm neutrality. His stillness seemed to unnerve Croft more than any angry retort would have. The man's smile tightened at the edges. "This is a private matter, rancher," Croft said, his tone hardening slightly. "Between me and my family. I'd advise you to step aside." Elias shifted his weight, a slow, deliberate movement. He looked from Croft to the 2 hired guns, then back to Croft. "The lady says she's not your wife," he said, his voice even and carrying clearly in the quiet air. "And the horse belongs to her." Croft laughed, a short, ugly sound. "The lady is confused. She's been unwell. As for the horse, she stole it. I have a bill of sale." "She has a bridle," Elias replied, the statement nonsensical to anyone but the 3 people on the porch. The words were a shield, a declaration of the truth of what had happened in that dusty town. A small, almost invisible signal passed between them. A line had been drawn. Croft's mask of civility finally dropped. His eyes went cold. "I don't have time for this," he snarled. "I'm taking what's mine. You can either stand aside, or you can be buried here." He nodded to his men. They began to dismount, their movements slow and menacing, their intentions clear. This was it, the moment she had been running from for months. Lena's heart hammered against her ribs. But as one of the men swung his leg over his saddle, a new sound split the air. Not a gunshot, a click. A loud, definitive, metallic click. It was the sound of Elias cocking the hammer on the big Sharps rifle he held loosely at his side. It was a sound that spoke of immense power, a sound that promised a catastrophic end to any argument. The men froze, all three of them. They knew that sound. They knew what a buffalo gun could do to a man at this range. It was not a weapon for a gunfight. It was a weapon for an execution. Croft stared at Elias, his face a mixture of disbelief and fury. He had misjudged this quiet, weathered rancher. He had mistaken stillness for weakness. It was a fatal error. "You're making a mistake," Croft hissed, his hand hovering over his own pistol. "She's not worth it." Elias's gaze was like chips of granite. "It's my land," he said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl. "And you're not welcome on it." The silence that followed was absolute. The sun had dipped below the horizon, plunging the valley into a deep, purple twilight. The four men were locked in a tableau of imminent violence, a breath away from a bloody conclusion. And then Lena moved. She stepped forward, positioning herself slightly in front of Elias, the small Colt in her hand now, held steady, pointed not at Croft but at the ground between them. The move was unexpected. It shifted the focus, broke the terrible tension between the men. Her face was pale in the gloom, but her eyes burned with a cold fire. She was no longer the hunted, haunted creature who had stumbled into town. She was a woman standing on her own ground, defending her own life. "You will leave," she said, her voice not loud, but carrying the unmistakable ring of command. It was the voice of someone who had been stripped of everything and had found something unbreakable in the wreckage. Silas Croft stared at her, his handsome face contorted with rage and disbelief. He had owned this woman, or so he had believed. He had controlled her through fear, through violence, through the legal fiction of a marriage she had been forced into. To see her standing there, defiant, protected, was an intolerable affront to his power. "You have nothing," he spat at her. "You are nothing without me." "I have a horse," she said, her voice steady. "And I have a rifle, and I am not your wife. Not anymore." Her words were simple, but they were a declaration of independence, a severing of the final chain. She was reclaiming her own story, right here, right now, in the face of the man who had tried to steal it from her. Croft's hand twitched toward his gun, a last, desperate grasp for control. He couldn't let her win. He couldn't let this dirt farmer and this broken woman humiliate him. But before his fingers could close around the handle, Elias spoke again, his voice a low rumble that vibrated in the chest. "I'd think carefully about that," he said. His Sharps was no longer at his side. It was shouldered, the long, heavy barrel aimed squarely at Croft's chest. There was no shaking, no hesitation, just the calm, deadly certainty of a man who knew how to use his tools. The two hired guns, who were paid to be bullies, not to die for another man's pride, exchanged a nervous glance. They looked at the big rifle, then at their employer's face, and they saw a losing fight. One of them slowly, deliberately, raised his hands, showing them empty. The other followed suit a second later. The betrayal was complete. Croft was alone. His face went slack with shock, his arrogance crumbling into dust. He looked at his men, at Lena's unyielding stare, at the black unblinking eye of the Sharps rifle, and he knew it was over. The violence he had brought with him had been met with a quiet, immovable wall of resolve he could not break. He was a man who understood power, and the power in this valley no longer belonged to him. Without another word, his face a mask of cold fury, he yanked his horse's reins, wheeling the animal around so sharply it snorted in protest. His men, relieved, scrambled back onto their own mounts. They rode away, not looking back, their retreat a cloud of ignominious dust in the deepening twilight. They were gone. The threat had passed. Lena stood watching them go until they were nothing but small specks on the horizon, her body trembling with the aftermath of adrenaline. The Colt felt immensely heavy in her hand. She lowered it slowly. The silence that rushed back in was different from the one before. It was clean. It was peaceful. It was the sound of freedom. Elias lowered his rifle, the tension draining from his shoulders. He looked at Lena, at the fierce, proud set of her jaw, the light of battle still in her eyes. He had seen her stand her ground. He had seen her find her voice. "You were right," he said quietly. "It was your fight." She turned to him, 1,000 emotions swirling in her eyes: gratitude, relief, exhaustion. She opened her mouth to say something, to thank him, to explain, but no words came. There were no words big enough to contain what had just happened between them. He simply nodded, accepting her silence as she had once accepted his. He understood. He turned and walked back into the cabin, leaving her alone on the porch with the vast, quiet night and the first true peace she had known in years. She had not been rescued. She had been given the ground on which to save herself. Weeks turned into a month, and the month bled into the turning of the season. The fierce heat of summer softened into the golden light of early autumn. The grass in the hills cured to a pale yellow, and the wind carried a new, sharper edge. The memory of Silas Croft's visit faded, becoming less like a raw wound and more like a distant, silvery scar, a reminder of a battle fought and won. The rhythm of the ranch was restored, but it was a new rhythm, one of two people instead of one. The shared silence between Lena and Elias was no longer a buffer, but a comfortable shared space. It was filled with the unspoken language of mutual respect, of tasks done in unison, of knowing where the other would be without having to ask. Lena had found a home, not in the cabin itself, but in the work, in the land, in the quiet dignity of a life earned with her own two hands. The ghosts that had haunted her on the road had been banished by the rising sun and the solid weight of a post-hole digger. She was no longer running, she was building. Elias, in turn, found the hard shell of his solitude cracking in small, almost imperceptible ways. He found himself listening for the sound of her footsteps in the morning. He found himself making enough coffee for two without thinking about it. The photograph on the mantelpiece no longer seemed like a monument to a finished life, but a part of a longer story, one that had not yet ended. The presence of her quiet strength in his home had not erased his grief, but it had made it less of an all-consuming void. It had let a little light in. One evening, after the work was done, they sat on the porch, watching the stars begin to prick the deep velvet of the sky. It had become a ritual, a quiet closing to their days. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The only sounds were the chirping of crickets and the soft sigh of the night breeze. Elias reached into the small leather pouch he always carried at his belt. His movements were slow, deliberate. He took something out and placed it on the small rickety table that stood between their chairs. It was the ring, the simple gold band she had sold for a pittance in a dusty general store. It caught the faint starlight, a tiny perfect circle of warmth in the cool twilight. Lena stared at it, her breath caught in her chest. She had thought it was gone forever, melted down, lost, a part of a past she had been forced to discard. To see it now, here, felt like seeing a ghost. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with a question she could not voice. "Miller." "The shopkeeper," Elias said, his voice low and steady, his gaze on the ring, not on her. "He gives a poor price for a person's past. I thought it was worth more." He had carried it with him all this time. Through the waiting, through the confrontation, he had kept it safe. He had bought it back for her on the very first day, a silent act of faith in a stranger. He had waited until she was no longer the desperate woman running from a monster, but the strong, capable woman who had faced him down. He was not giving it to her. He was returning it. It was not a gift. It was a restoration. Lena reached out a trembling hand and touched the ring. The metal was cool, familiar. It was a link to who she had been, to the girl who had once believed in vows and forevers. But it was not a chain, it was just a piece of her story, a story she was now in control of. She looked at Elias, at his weathered face, his calm, steady eyes. He had given her a horse, he had given her a job, he had stood with her. And now he was giving her back a piece of herself she thought she had lost. Tears welled in her eyes, the first she had allowed herself to shed in all these long, hard months. They were not tears of sorrow or of fear. They were tears of gratitude, so profound it was a physical ache in her chest. She did not put the ring on. She simply closed her hand around it, the smooth, solid circle a comforting weight in her palm. "Thank you," she whispered, the words barely audible. He gave a single, slow nod. The debt was paid. All debts were paid. They sat there for a long time as the sky turned from deep indigo to black, two solitary people who had found in each other's quiet strength an unexpected sanctuary. The past was not erased, but it no longer had power. The future was not certain, but it was no longer a thing to be feared. It was simply the next morning, and the morning after that, a series of days to be met with honest work, quiet companionship, and the simple, profound dignity of a life reclaimed. What is a person's worth? Is it what they have? Is it the story others tell about them? Or is it something deeper, something that can't be bought or sold, stolen or bartered away? Elias Thorne looked at a woman others saw as a problem and chose to see a person. Lena, in turn, was given a chance not to be rescued, but to find the strength that was already inside her. Sometimes the greatest kindness we can offer someone is not to save them, but to give them the tools and the ground to save themselves. To see the value in them when no one else will, and to trust that they will know what to do with it. Thank you for spending this time with us. If this story resonated with you, we hope you'll join our community by liking this video and subscribing to our channel. And we'd love to read your thoughts in the comments below. What does it mean to you to have someone truly see you? Until next time.